afternoon, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. I finished my official career with University of Maryland Extension almost 2 years ago, so I'm now retired, but I'm really active still in the industry um, and also with the University of Maryland. You can see there's some websites that I do. I try to keep a pretty active Facebook page as well. So some of the pictures you'll see here are part of my farm. I have a small farm. I breed about 35 to 40 Katahdins. I recently got some goats again and also started breeding meat rabbits. So our topic today is hoof care. And I think you'll agree with me, this isn't our favorite thing about sheep and goats. In fact, it's probably one of our least favorite things. I think when I was in college and we had to trim hoofs as part of the sheep production class, I don't think any of us looked forward to that. At the same time, it's a very important um, part of raising sheep and goats. And I'm going to say, um, whoops, I made my it's equally important for sheep and goats. I have found that where trimming hooves is concerned, it's almost like goats need it more, but where diseases are concerned, like foot rot, sheep seem to be more seriously affected. Hooves are so important that last year I actually traveled to Ontario, Canada, and I spoke at 2 day-long conferences on hoof health. So very important. It is an important part of management. Again, not our favorite part, but one we certainly have to address. Um, it's kind of like, think of yourself. If your feet hurt, you're not feeling very good. You don't want to do anything. You just want to sit down and watch TV and sit on the couch. You don't want to do anything. So feet are very important. It affects performance of our animals. It affects their health. It affects their welfare. When people out here get turned in, to the Humane Society, um, lack of hoof care is probably one of the primary reasons they get turned in. So it's something that is most definitely a welfare issue. And so as producers, we need to check our animals. Notice I said check. I didn't necessarily say trim. I said we need to check them regularly for disease and for excess growth. It's kind of like parasites. We used to say, well, you need to deworm these animals. And now we kind of say what you need to do frequently is you need to monitor them. And then when they do need treatment, then you need to do it. Well, it's kind of similar for hooves. You need to check them regularly. And when you need to trim them, you need to do that. And when there's evidence of disease, you need to do that as well. And the other thing, and again, just like parasites, in fact, the two are actually very closely related. If you have any animal with excessive or abnormal hoof growth and or chronic hoof disease, you should cull these. Now, I understand that people keep sheep and goats for all different reasons. And when you got a lot of animals, it's easy to cull problem animals. When you have a few, it gets a little bit more difficult. But you'll be doing yourself a favor if you get rid of the problems. Same thing with parasites. The ones that can't handle parasites, especially the males, should be sent down the road. And we don't want to keep these animals with bad hooves. I don't know if I have a picture in here later, but we did a buck test in Maryland for about 11 years. It was a meat goat buck test, pasture-based, mostly Kiko goats. And I remember one year, the buck that was the top performing buck in the test in terms of his growth rate, his resistance and resilience to parasites, his ribeye area, all that data was outstanding. But he had these terribly overgrown hoofs. And not just overgrown, but very abnormal in the growth. And so I cut him from the sale. I said, no, not only can he not be our top performing buck, but you need to get rid of him. Because sure enough, in future years, that same consigner had bucks with similar problems. So there's some heritability to some of those hoof defects. So why do we need to trim hooves? And I can tell you nowadays, there's differing opinions on trimming hooves. When I was up in Canada, I told people kind of people's different perspectives on things. I said in the UK, they don't like to trim hooves. They like to give antibiotic injections where their hoof care is concerned. In Canada, they like to trim hooves, and in the US, we like to soak feet, kind of some different perspectives. But there are many instances or routinely where we may need to trim hooves to keep our animals from getting lame, to keep air to allow air to get inside of the hoof because the bacteria that cause disease are anaerobic, meaning they thrive where there's no oxygen. So we want air to get in there. We want to have a flat surface, and we want to remove the mud and feces or anything else that gets inside of those, trapped in those hooves, that can also cause diseases. And we need to promote proper hoof growth because it has a lot to do with the soundness and how that animal develops. This is particularly true of animals that are confined and are well fed, for example, dairy goats. Um, in fact, I'll share a little bit more information about dairy goats. So, how often should you trim hooves? It depends. That's the classic extension answer. You ask your extension agent, says, well, it depends, because it does. Because the need can vary from never. If you think of a dry, rocky climate, these goats in the picture, it's not exactly a dry climate, but it's certainly a rocky climate. They're able to wear their hooves down a little bit. There can be situations where they don't need to have their hooves trimmed. In fact, I still remember a producer, I have no idea if he's in the audience, but years ago, when I was visiting Missouri for the Missouri Livestock Symposium, we visited a goat farm, and he was pasture based, and he said if any goat needed its feet trimmed, he called it. So he was going to gradually get rid of the need for hoof trimming by selecting animals or deselecting animals that required having their hooves trimmed. The need for hoof trimming is affected by many different factors, and I'll show that here in the next slide. First, we've got genetics. There are differences between the species. Goats seem to need trimmed more often than sheep. Breed or type, uh, you know, there are differences within the goat breeds and the sheep breeds with regards to how hoofs grow. The animal has individual genetics for its hoof growth. Maybe we don't know as much about it as we'd like to, but we know there's a genetic component. The color of the hoofs, there is some beliefs, as well as some things that are proven regarding the superiority of black or dark covered hoofs. I know when I select a Katahdin ram to put in my flock, I very much want one with black feet. Again, some things proven, some things not, but it could affect hoof growth. And then the structure of the hoof and how it grows. There's going to be differences among individual animals. And of course, the other side to everything is the environment. Whatever an animal is, including people, we're a combination of our genetics and the environment in which we live. So soil moisture and characteristics will have a lot to do with how those hoofs grow, whether they get worn down, the terrain, again, a rocky area. Hoofs don't grow as much where it's dry, different times of the year, whether or not the animals are housed. There's pros and cons to raising sheep and goats predominantly on pasture and versus raising them in confinement. And one of the negatives we pick up in confinement, especially with deep bedded housing, not so much slatted floors, but deep straw bedded housing, is their hoofs grow more. And usually what goes along with that confinement is we tend to feed them more concentrated diets. And so again, we get more hoof growth in these more intensive systems. So give and take on every management decision we make. I mentioned I was going to say a little bit about dairy goats. When I went up to Canada, the first place I did my presentation was in an area that had a lot of dairy goat farms, and they were farms that, let's say, on average had about 400 does, and they were all confinement, which is pretty typical around the world that most large dairy goats are raised in confinement. And so, as you can imagine, hoofs can be a very big issue. They're generally in bedded barns like you see here, and they're well fed because they're high producing dairy goats. So there was a study recently published in New Zealand. New Zealand has a lot of dairy goats. They have a dairy goat co-op that's quite successful in marketing mostly powdered milk. anyhow, they looked at the hoof growth of these 5-month-old Saanen does that were in housing. And I won't read this slide to you. You can kind of look at it. But what they found was that trimming every 4 months, so 3 times a year, was not sufficient in these animals to prevent overgrowth, its effect on conformation and the joints, particularly in the hind hooves. So the more intensively animals are raised, we need to pay even closer attention to the hooves, particularly as they relate to conformation and longevity and things like that. And that certainly fits the case with a lot of our larger dairy goat farms. When should you trim hooves? Well, we don't want to do much in that last trimester of pregnancy. Same with shearing. We want to shear before we land, but we don't want to do it within that last month. Ideally, we would do it in conjunction with other management tasks. Anytime we can combine our handling so that we handle these animals less, it's less labor, it's less stress, and it's less stress on the animals. For those of you who show your sheep and goats, we know how important it is to have the hooves trimmed for the show, but we don't really want to do it on the day of the show or too close to the show, just in case we accidentally cut too close or cause them to be a little bit lame. Ideally, getting back to dairy goats or dairy sheep, preferably we don't want to do that in the milking parlor. You don't, hoof trimming, we don't necessarily like doing it. Well, they don't necessarily like having it done. So you don't want to do it in an important place like the milking parlor, because they do remember handling and handlers. You want to do it when the hooves are soft. And obviously, this can be challenging at different times of the year. Um, if you trim the whole flock or herd, obviously you want to pick times of the year where those hooves are soft. If you have a particular animal that has a problem and its hooves need trimmed because of that problem, you might have to kind of soak those hooves individually so that you can work on them. What do you need to trim hooves? Obviously, you need something to, you need a pair of hoof shears or hoof trimmers, a hoof knife. Um, I used to think all you really needed were hoof shears, but I can tell you to really do a proper job of hoof trimming, you need a hoof knife as well. You need a small brush to be able to brush debris from the hooves. You need a disinfectant because you're going to want to disinfect those hoof shears and knives between animals, particularly if there's diseases on the farm. You need a pump or spray bottle because ideally after you trim those feet, you want to squirt them with something like zinc sulfate. It's nice to have a pair of gloves like you see here in the picture. If you trim a lot of hooves, it can be hard on your hands, so a pair of tight-fitting gloves can help with that. Obviously, you need a method to restrain that animal, and you need time. It takes time. Hoof trimming can be very labor intensive. So the tools that we use for trimming hooves, most of us probably use what you see here, which are the handheld hoof trimmers or shears. The other is a hoof knife. You can kind of see it's got a sharp edge and it's got a little hook at the end. Some people will use a hoof rasp. I'd never had the pleasure of using more automated systems, power trimmers or electric hoof knife that you see pictured there at the bottom left. But certainly the more animals you have and the more frequency of trimming, if you had 50 animals but you trimmed them 4 times a year, it would definitely pay, I think, to have something better than a pair of a hand trimmers. Or if you just simply have, a giant flock or herd and you do it once a year, it would definitely be worth it, because it can be not only backbreaking work, but it can be hard on your hands and you can get blisters and that sort of thing. Again, restraint is a big part of trimming hooves. And there's other things that we need to be able to restrain sheep and goats for. Ideally, we don't want to do it like you see pictured here. If you have just a couple, I suppose it's okay. But the most common way to restrain sheep for hoof trimming, particularly if the flock's not too large, is simply to tip them on their rumps. When the sheep is sitting on its rump, you've got pretty well control of it. Um, the other way is to use a deck chair, and I have pictures of each of these in the next slide, where the sheep is just really sitting like it's on its rump, only it's in a chair with a webbing. For goats and sheep to some extent, you can simply lift their hooves while they're standing and their head is secured. Same thing with either a sheep or goat on a fitting stand or a milking stand. An elevated platform with a headlock. Um, when we did our buck test and also any of our sheep research at our research center, we had a handling system that had an elevated platform with a head gate. And if we had to do something with hooves, which we didn't frequently do, but we would do them while they were on that elevated platform. The more animals you have, or the more frequency of trimming, it's worth investing in a turn or tilt table or squeeze or cradle. They have all different names. They can be manual, where you turn the animal over in the equipment, or you push a button. And increasingly for large flocks, a new method of handling, and I don't know so much for goats, but for sheep, is a conveyor. And I have a picture of that in the next slide. It has you fill the conveyor with so many animals that you do things with. It does make a difference whether it's sheep or goats in terms of restraint. Tipping and using a deck chair doesn't work nearly as well with goats as sheep, probably because of their anatomy. My own personal experience suggests that goats seem to be more tolerant of having their feet lifted versus sheep, where it seems to be a declaration of war if you try to trim them while they're standing, but that could just be my experience. Here's some examples of these different restraints. The sheep at the top, I think that's one of those ones they call a spin doctor. Most of those, they'll do it. You can see it's kind of halfway. I prefer to trim them when they're like, as you see here. I actually have one of these. It's not my sheep, but I have one of those. The opposite corner, this was up at the workshop in Ontario. Again, it looks like another one of those spin type doctors. And this was actually a contractor who would bring this equipment to a farm and do the hoof trimming. And you can see he's got the goat upside down. Up top, you see the sheep just sitting happy as a lark in the sheep chair. So that can save your back. You just sort of, you secure it against a fence and you back the sheep into it. I have found that it's a little bit harder with really big animals. Like, I probably couldn't do a 200-pound Suffolk ewe. And I actually found that I need sometimes to put a little seat belt on them so they stay secure. The other picture is one of those conveyors. Um, most of the time the sheep are upright when they're doing things to them, but here's an example where that sheep is available for crutching or for hooves. But again, you fill that whole thing up, you connect it into the handling system. The lower left, again, not my preferable way to trim feet, where you got them on the ground like that, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do, and sometimes the big male doesn't always fit into the restraining equipment. The traditional method, you see the sheep setting on its rump. Sheep are round, fat. A lot of them, if they don't have wool, they still probably have a nice thick hair coat, so they set pretty well on their butts. And there you've got a goat having probably a show goat having its feet trimmed while it's on the stand. So lots of different ways to restrain them. You want to do it in the way that causes the least amount of stress for both you and the animal, and that's within your pocketbook. Because obviously the turntables, cradles, and conveyors all come with a price tag. So proper hoof trimming, you can download or look at YouTube videos on trimming feet. You can learn how to trim them at field days and places like that. But the best way to do it is, you'll just start doing it, and you'll figure out and learn things as you go along. The first thing you do is you clean the hoof out, both the claws and in between the claws. get the manure out, the debris out. It can be a pretty messy job. You want to trim the excess growth, and you want to do small pieces at a time. You want to really avoid taking a lot off at one time. Um, and when you're finished, you want to, like I said, you want to spray the hooves with zinc sulfate. You want to disinfect the tools between animals. The hoof that you see there in the picture, that's not a difficult one to trim. It can use trimming, but it's not a difficult one. You're going to have animals sometimes, for whatever reason, really have badly grown, badly shaped hooves, and it may take you several times to get them growing right. And I'm honestly going to say that sometimes you can't get them growing right. And again, that to me would be a reason for culling, particularly if it's a male that you want to use for breeding, because we don't want to perpetuate those traits. So even though we don't know as much as we would like to know about the genetics of hooves, I know that when you get rid of problems, you get rid of problems.
There is a question probably very related to that from Kathleen Davis in the chat, saying that do all goats not need hoof trimming, only select goats and sheep, or can you use genetics to get rid of the need?
There's definitely differences in animals. I mean, in a, I take and look at my flock of 35 to 40, and there's probably so many in there that their hooves look like perfect all the time. Then there's another subset that seems to grow a lot more. And like I said, why we don't know specifically necessarily the genetics of it, we do know that there's probably a genetic component of it. So if you get rid of those that grow fast, grow abnormal, and keep that within the context of how you're raising them. You don't compare a group of animals that are housed in the barn and being fed a lot of concentrates versus ones that are out on pasture and having a chance to wear down their hooves. So within, it's kind of like when you compare any animals, they have to be within the same contemporary group. They have to be managed the same. And then so when the difference is, then the difference you see, you would attribute more to genetics. But if you have the power of culling, and the power of culling gets bigger as your herd or flock gets larger. Because think about it, if you only have 20 sheep, you can probably find a reason to cull all 20 of them. But if you had 200, you might truly be able to get rid of some of those problems you don't want. So I don't care what we're talking about. If you get rid of the animals with problems, particularly the male, because he's going to influence a lot more offspring than one female, you will clean your flock or herd up from problems. So, think about when you select a male for breeding, whether you're buying one or selecting one that you've bred, you know, try to get him as perfect as he can be. Not just he's a good grower, but also these health and fitness traits, hooves and parasites being the two biggest ones regarding that. Uh, at the same time, I often say the more you trim hooves, the more you trim hooves. It's kind of like cutting your grass. The more you cut your grass, the more you're going to cut your grass. Avoid overzealous hoof trimming. We don't want to draw blood. One of the reasons in the UK, which has a lot of hoof problems because of its climate, they really discourage hoof trimming because they find that provides the venue or the opportunity for these bacteria to get into the hooves. In fact, I remember reading once, and I don't know if it's advocated widespread, but they said, don't cut the tip off. Of course, I always cut the tip off, but the issue was providing an opening for the bacteria.
There is another question. What do you do when you have a hoof that is infected already?
We are going to get to that.
Okay, great.
Okay, these are just some diagrams, and again, you can find tons of them online. And I know this one on the right's a little bit crude, but it does go through the steps of digging the dirt out, trimming parallel to that hairline, um, trying to get the heel at the same level as the toe, cutting the flaps kind of in between the two claws. And so again, the idea is to cut a little bit off at a time. When you see pink, you know that you're as close as you should get. And obviously, if you nick it, and we all do that sometimes by accident, you definitely know you've gone too far. So for one that's got really bad hooves, and I'm talking about growth, not disease, again, you may want to trim it a few times. Trim it a few times. And when you're finished, you want the hoof to look like what you see in that number 6 picture. That's parallel. The bottom of the hoof is parallel to that hairline. So now we are going to switch to some diseases, because hooves, to me, there's just two parts of it. There's simply uh, keeping the hooves in good shape for the animal's overall, again, conformation, joint health, things like that. Again, particularly for confined and well-fed animals. That's a big part of it. And for some farms, again, like those dairy farms, that's the primary part of it. For a lot of the industry, and I'm going to say particularly sheep, but goats too, it's the diseases that we get. And hoof trimming does affect the diseases and is part of the trimming, but it's not the whole picture. So there's a lot of diseases that can affect the hooves of sheep and goats. And I'm going to talk, well, actually, I'm going to talk about more than these three, but these are the primary three. One is an abscess, a hoof abscess. The second one is foot scald, and the third one is foot rot. So this is a diagram that I kind of redid that they made at Michigan State University. And it does a really good job differentiating between a foot abscess and foot scald and foot rot. They are all bacterial diseases. So not everything that affects the hoof is bacterial, but these are all bacterial diseases, uh, anaerobic bacteria. So again, the reason for keeping the hooves in good shape is so you don't provide an opportunity for that bacteria to get in. They all start with moisture and trauma. So trauma to that hoof. So think about it. If you're in West Texas, you're probably not going to deal with a lot of hoof problems because it's not a very moist climate. Go all the way to the United Kingdom, where it's very wet, and it's why their hoof problems are so endemic over there. So what happens first? So that moisture and that trauma, it happens between the two claws. So the in between the interdigital skin, it gets soft, it gets damaged. That's what happens first. That's the precursor to these other problems. So next, what happens depends on the type of bacteria. So if you look at a foot abscess, actinomyces pyogenes, I've actually identified that when I used to have a few sheep that would get abscesses, and they would be close enough to CL areas that I would go ahead and have the pus tested. Well, it never came back as CL, but it came back as that particular bacteria. So it can cause a lot of different things in our animals, and one of the things it can cause is a foot abscess. The other bacteria, Fusobacterium necrophorum, invades the foot. And that bacteria is a normal part of a sheep and goat and cattle farm. You know, it's there. It's in there. And if that's all that invades the foot, we get foot scald. So between the digits. If we get this other bacteria, which is an introduced bacteria, meaning every farm does not have it, that's where we get foot rot. And it's only been relatively recently where we've sort of differentiated between two different kinds of foot rot. Let's just say a good one and a bad one. So a benign foot rot, it has to do with the type of enzyme that's in the bacteria. If they have the APRB2, they get that nice foot rot, benign foot rot, and if they get the APRV2, you get the virulent or the bad foot rot. So, you know, that's only been I don't know how many years, but more recently um, recognized. We used to just say foot rot, but now we differentiate between the two types. So let's talk a little bit about these bacteria. So the one that causes foot scald, again, that is on the farm. It lives in the soil for extended periods of time outside of the animal. So if your animal's got nice and healthy, they're doing fine, but then we run into some really rainy weather or wet conditions, and we can get foot scald. Okay. The one that causes foot rot has a more limited lifespan outside of the animal. So basically 2 weeks. It's probably less than 2 weeks, but 2 weeks is basically what we consider to be the life of that bacteria outside the sheep. So if a pasture or paddock hasn't had any infected sheep on it for 2 weeks, we consider that to be clean. That 2 week period is a very important factor to understand when we implement a plan to eradicate foot rot. Now, that bacteria, on the other hand, can live in the feet of sheep and goats indefinitely, even when it's dry. Even when it's dry. So just because you don't have any limping sheep or goats doesn't mean you do not have foot rot. Okay, if that bacteria is present on your farm. And there are at least 20 different strains of the bacteria that causes foot rot, and not all have the same potential to cause disease. Some are not as bad as the other. And it's one of the challenges with developing vaccines, and also even for doing genetic testing, is because around the world, there's different strains of that bacteria. And so if there's a vaccine for foot rot, does it have the strains that are causing problems on your farm? That becomes the question. So let's talk about each of these diseases. So a foot abscess. These are a couple of pictures, might be examples of foot abscesses. So again, you've got that Actinomyces bacteria that invades the tissue because of the interdigital, between the toes infection. You usually have lameness. Lameness is a very generic term that has lots of causes in sheep and goats. It can be very painful. There can be swelling. It can be very hot to the touch. Mostly we see foot abscesses in mature animals, in heavy animals. It's usually only one hoof or one digit that's affected. The treatment is to trim that affected hoof. Again, avoid over trimming and clean that abscess to allow drainage. Uh, Usually antibiotics and anti-inflammatories are given. And of course, anti-inflammatories have always been prescription drugs, and now, of course, antibiotics are too. So you would need to work with a vet to administer these. They make those little things that can, if you've got one hoof that you're working on, they make those little boots that you can use. Sometimes you soak feet, a lot of different treatments for those individual hooves. And sometimes they can be really challenging to get these animals over it. Foot scald, sometimes we also call it benign foot rot because they're very similar. It's caused by that first bacteria. We talked about the one that's always present. So basically we see an inflammation or redness between the toes or the claws. Don't normally see the hoof involved. But the foot scald is the precursor to the foot abscesses and foot rot. So this is where it starts. We see outbreaks during periods of wet weather. In some cases, there's not much you can do about it. But on the other hand, you look at, what are those risk factors? And usually it's that moisture, so keeping animals in well-drained areas, not overstocking, things like that, not having those hot spots on pasture, putting down some lime, anything you can do to be drier. And the treatment for foot scald is and they can be pretty sore. It amazes me. I guess it doesn't amaze me, but they can really be in a lot of pain, and it can really affect them. Even if it's I say just foot scald between the toes, that can still be really painful for them. So you don't just let it go. You need to treat it. You need to be happy that it's not foot rot, but you still need to treat it. All right, foot rot. So foot rot is caused by both of those bacteria, the one that's always on the farm and the one that gets introduced to the farm. So those two bacteria work together to cause foot rot. It's highly contagious. Foot abscess is not contagious. Foot scald, although it looks like it's contagious, it isn't. It's just that all the animals are exposed to the similar environment. But foot rot is highly contagious. It is one of the worst diseases in the sheep industry, probably second to parasites in goats, perhaps, but definitely a big problem. And as I mentioned, there's the benign foot rot and the virulent foot rot, good and bad. So the benign foot rot, and benign means not harmful. It's a nice word. We like it. I guess we don't like having it, but we're happy it's not the other kind of foot rot. So that's why we like it. So it's caused by a more benign strain of that same bacteria. It is very similar to foot scald, and I don't think you would be able to differentiate it without actually testing, identifying the bacteria, whatever. I think there's some odor with it, but personally, sheep feet don't smell good to begin with. Goat feet don't smell good to begin with. But it's not the same odor that you'll find with the virulent foot rot. It occurs mostly seasonally when conditions are wet. So spring, you get out of winter, comes spring, spring is wet in many of our climates. And so that's when we start to see hoof problems. It's usually controllable with foot baths and moving the animals to a dry area. The very first year, or the first time we had goats at our research center, we elected to rotationally graze them and move shelters and water as they moved to different paddocks. And it was a particularly wet year, and we got foot scald. And we were able to clear it up just really by running them through foot bath once. And in future years, we elected to go with more of a central laneway system where we could put their shelters on stones. And so we never had hoof problems ever again. But there's give and take with that management decision. The central laneway was more vulnerable for parasites. So again, you get something and sometimes you give up something. So the really harmful foot rot, extremely severe or harmful, again, one of the plagues of the sheep industry. You can see a typical picture below. The one on top actually has maggots in it. Huge welfare issue, because you can imagine the pain that these animals are in. It gets inside the horn, in the hoof itself. It also often causes the hoof to separate. Both toes are usually affected. It definitely has a foul odor. Again, feet don't smell good, but foot rot really smells. It usually is a more serious, or I think typically has been more serious problem in sheep. I think you see the more benign type of foot rot in goats, but they do share the disease. So everything's possible. Again, a significant welfare issue. Controlling it and particularly eradicating it can be difficult and can be time consuming, but it can be done. Where do you get foot rot? It usually walks onto the farm in the hooves of infected sheep or goats. They're usually bought in animals. Most of the time, quarantine would detect it, but there can even be carriers, and it could also depend on the time of the year. To a lesser extent, it's possible from contaminated equipment. Again, the hoof shears or equipment were not cleaned. Contaminated bedding at sales, fairs, and during transport in the hoofs of cattle. There is some cross infection. Pastures and barn lots where infected animals have been, on footwear. People who come to your farm, that's why it's a good idea to have a foot bath or little plastic booties. Those aren't the more common methods, but they are certainly possible. But most of the time, it walks onto the farm. Most of the time, you buy it and you didn't pay anything extra for it. So again, just to reiterate, you get the tissue between the claws gets irritated, and it allows the bacteria, that first bacteria, that F necro, yeah, that one. It allows that to get in, the one that causes scald. That becomes a precursor for a foot abscess or foot rot. um, Foot scald, the factors: warmth and moisture, kind of like parasites, warmth and moisture. Overgrown hooves. I'm not saying hooves that generally need a little bit of trimming, but ones that are really overgrown, that have those pockets in them, those that grow abnormally. Those are conditions that predispose them. Unlike parasites, when an animal is infected or exposed to the bacteria that causes foot rot, they do not develop any kind of immunity. Immunity is a very key component for learning to, or reaching the point where we can control parasites better. Doesn't help us a bit on foot rot. Doesn't mean there's not a genetic component, but they don't develop naturally immunity after they've been infected or exposed to the bacteria that causes foot rot. So how do we prevent it? Because I want to talk about preventing it before I talk about treating it. Biosecurity. And it's recommended that you write down your biosecurity plan, how you're going to manage sheep that come. Do not buy animals from flocks or herds that have a history of foot diseases or visible lameness. When somebody tells you all sheep and goat farms have foot rot, do not believe them. They do not all have foot rot. You need to stay away from the ones that do. Do not buy animals with unknown origins and histories. For example, a public auction, the livestock auction barn. Occasionally, there can be animals there that come with a history, but generally speaking, it's buyer beware. And then, when you do get new animals, and just assume they have foot rot. Just assume it. That's just the safe thing to do. Assume it. Put them in quarantine for at least 30 days. This includes animals that you have shown or exhibited, and keep that quarantine area away from the main flock or herd and take care of those animals last. When those animals are in quarantine, observe all of them for lameness and other problems. Carefully inspect each hoof, trim them if necessary, soak or spray each foot with a solution of zinc sulfate or copper tox. Another option is to give all your new animals an injection of a long-acting antibiotic from the macrolide family. Again, antibiotics, prescription, veterinarian. We'll talk about antibiotics in just a minute. At the end of the quarantine period, retrim them if necessary, and thoroughly look at those hoofs for signs of reinfection. If there's any evidence of infection, foot bathe them in zinc sulfate. Do not release any animal unless and until it is clean. If you have foot rot on your farm already, how do you get rid of it? Well, all of these things can be components of an eradication plan. A lot of it depends on the size of your herd and your budget. Obviously, hoof trimming is part of it. Foot soaking, separating clean and infected or exposed animals, having clean, dry places to put them. There are topical treatments that we especially use in smaller flocks. Antibiotics, I'll talk about that. Culling. Again, you want to get rid of a problem? Cull it. And never sell animals with foot rot to anyone except to a terminal market where those animals will go to slaughter. Several years ago, we had a grant project at the University of Maine. We worked with farmers, in this case, it was sheep farmers, to eradicate foot rot in a 28-day plan. So every week, those animals were handled. The feet were trimmed, inspected, and scored. They were separated into groups. They were foot bathed, dried, and put into clean areas. That was repeated for several weeks. If an animal became infected from the clean group, it moved to there, and vice versa. At the end of 4 weeks of this protocol of inspecting feet, soaking feet, drying feet, isolating any animal that at that point at day 28 was still infected, that animal was recommended that they be culled. So this was a protocol for eradicating foot rot, did not involve any antibiotics. So lots of ways to create foot baths. You can see typically it's a chute or a raceway. The circle picture at the bottom, they just created a foot bath in a pen. And there you can see a foot bath that's got, I think we have wool in there. It's like a soak pad. Zinc sulfate is the preferred solution. Copper sulfate and formaldehyde were used in the old days, but are not the preferred solution. We want these animals to stand in there for at least 5 minutes. They need an area to dry after the soaking, and they need to go to a clean area when they're finished. So this can be done for any size flock. You know, a simple pen like for that Suffolk, or a raceway for like those goats. You know, I visited a farm once. The entire barn was a foot bath, and a huge barn. We need clean pastures or lots, because remember that bacteria has a limited life outside of the animal, 2 weeks. So if we've rested a pasture or lot for 2 weeks, it's clean, and we can put these animals into those areas to help us eradicate foot rot. These are just some examples of scoring feet. The one on the left was from our main project. We either scored them as clean, suspect, and infected, and that scoring actually went into a research program looking at the genetics of foot rot. I'll talk about in a minute. The scoring on the right, just a little bit more sophisticated. I can't remember whether that's Australia or the UK, but they're a lot more precise on their scoring. We need to score them to describe what we're looking at it, to determine if our treatment's working, and if we're going to make genetic selection decisions on this. Antibiotics have become increasingly part of treating foot rot. Typically, we've used penicillin or tetracyclines, but the longest those drugs last in the system is about 48 hours, LA200 and a long-acting penicillin. What's preferred is that a long-acting antibiotic of the macrolide family, which has efficacy for 10 to 14 days, be used. In fact, there was a study conducted with Zactran in Europe, a couple of studies that showed it to be highly effective after one injection. Some of the animals might require anti-inflammatory medications because, again, foot rot can be a very painful disease. And as I've mentioned several times already, all of this has to be done under the advice of a veterinarian. Selecting for foot health. Somebody asked a little bit about that before. A lot more work has been done in sheep than in goats. We do know there's breed differences. We do know that in terms of foot rot resistance, it's a moderately heritable trait between 0.2 and 0.3. Just as a way of reference, twinning is only 0.1. So research is being done more in other countries, but to develop EVVs and marker-assisted selection for sheep. I was recently in Ireland, and they include hoof health in their selection indexes. On the dairy goat side, because I think, again, hoofs are a lot more important in dairy goats than they seem to be in meat goats that are raised more extensively. They do see some heritability in terms of selecting animals for different types of lameness issues. And they also find some varying correlations between lameness, claw disorder traits, and milk traits. And that's a link to the study, and hopefully more research will be done. I mentioned the University of Maine study. In addition to helping producers eradicate foot rot, a paper was recently published looking at the genetics of foot rot susceptibility in Katahdins, so the first study done with hair sheep. And they've certainly made progress for being able to identify a genetic marker test, because for foot rot, you don't want to select once they got it. You want to be able to select. In fact, this is true with all traits. Increasingly, we want to find ways to select before those traits actually express themselves. And to do that, we need to find out where on the genome those genes are. So this is a good study, and of course more research needs to be done before it has a practical application for producers. A few other diseases that can affect the hooves of sheep and goats, and I know we're getting short on time, so I'll try not to be too long. There's several blue tongue and foot and mouth disease I have at the bottom. They certainly can affect the hooves. Blue tongue does exist in the United States. Foot and mouth disease does not. I'm not going to specifically talk about those. Laminitis and white line disease. So laminitis is essentially founder. This is where we can get these really abnormally grown hooves. It's primarily an environmental cause. We're feeding high energy, high protein, lots of carbohydrates. And, again, you get back to some of these animals that are in confinement and fed well. So we can have some serious problems. We need to correct it with nutrition and environment. In the case where it's painful, anti-inflammatories, and some corrective hoof trimming, although I have to admit it can be quite challenging to be able to do some of that. And this isn't one on the animal, this is usually one on us because of the way in which we've managed them. White line disease is also called shelly hoof. I personally believe this is a much bigger problem than a lot of us recognize. It's a defect of the hoof wall and it pulls away from the foot. It's not one of the reasons we don't see it or notice it is because it's not painful like the other conditions. It can come and go. We don't completely understand it. We know nutrition is involved. We know there's genetics to it. It's pretty typical is that one on the left where you see that huge pocket. And of course, the one on the right has a small pocket, but stuff can get in there. So one of the things we want to do is carefully trim those hooves and get that stuff out of there. If there's any infection that results, obviously we want to treat that infection. But you can imagine, trimming that hoof on the left, that can be a little bit challenging. That can be a little bit challenging. So that white line disease, sometimes it's like I said, you don't have a bacterial disease, but it can still be a problem. So bottom line, the best things we can do where hooves are concerned, our best management practices, number one, and this isn't just for hooves, this is for everything, is biosecurity. And the biggest risk of biosecurity is the animals that you introduce to your farm or bring back from someplace. Okay. Regular checking of the hooves, just like regular monitoring of parasites, and trimming and any other intervention as needed. A hygienic environment, clean and dry. So I only clean my barn once a year, but there's always dry bedding on top. Pastures can have hot spots. Pastures can have low-lying areas. Animals can congregate around certain things. So keeping a very hygienic environment, not overstocking, things like that. Culling animals with hoof problems. Cull animals with problems, not only do you get rid of the problem that animal had, but potentially the problems that could repeat in the next generation. Good nutrition. Nutrition's the foundation of so much of what we do. Energy, protein, vitamins, and minerals. Don't overfeed, don't underfeed, but don't overfeed any of them. Too much energy and protein can cause laminitis. It can, a lot of other problems. Feed what they need. Zinc, and I think magnesium or manganese is the other one that both of those have been identified as being very important for hoof health. If you have chronic problems, and I'm thinking about maybe a benign foot rot or a foot scald, you can do periodic foot bathing. It can be part of what you do, twice a year, or you can have walk through foot baths. They can be wet or dry, a place where they have to go through. Vaccination, I know the vaccine's available in California. I don't really know if it's available anywhere else, and it's one of those vaccines that doesn't prevent the disease, but reduces the incidence. But I'll just throw it out there for what it is. And that is what I have to say about hoof health. And again, it's not something we love, and sometimes I'm guilty sometimes of neglecting it, and we need to pay attention to it. It's like I tell people every time they get a hand on their animal to go ahead and check its FOMACHA score and its body condition score. Well, I think we should look at the feet too, And maybe it's only necessary, excuse me, necessary to pick up one hoof, but we should do it. Questions? I
And
had actually turned off the chat box.
yeah, just you want to see there are 2, 3 questions there. Can you go over there?
Foot rot. Let's see how far do I got to go up? I'm trying to see how far. I guess I go all the way up to the top. A few people have bad weather. Bad weather. I have a former was told he did not have to trim his sheep's feet. He was told by the guy he bought the sheep from. Well, sometimes you don't have to trim feet or you don't have to trim them often, but that should be, you should come to that conclusion because what somebody else did doesn't matter. And plus, when the sheep were in a different environment, things could be different. I remember just a similar story is we used to get bucks in our buck test from really good producers that would do egg counts at home and they'd be low egg counts and they'd come to the buck test and their egg counts would go really, really high. And they said, well, what happened? My goats never had it. I said, well, pat yourself on the back. I mean, you're doing something right at your place. We've got them in an environment where we're trying to challenge them with parasites. And obviously, their goats didn't meet the challenge. So just whatever your neighbor did or whoever you bought them from is, listen to them, but you have to make your own decisions. I would never tell anybody to never trim feet. I would, again, I'd say, you just have to learn when you need to do it. Do all goats not need? Oh, I think we already talked. You already asked me a question about, yeah, they're about some animals needing it, some not, selecting ones that have problems. Uh, what do you recommend when the hoof is infected due to poor sanitation? And that happens a lot. That producer needs to improve that sanitation, and whether that's creating, kicking them outside, um, more bedding, uh, elevated places, like for goats to get on elevated places. You have to poor sanitation cannot be tolerated because it's not just hooves, coccidia, everything else. In some cases, people simply have too many animals, and that's why they have poor sanitation, and they just need to cut back, and that's hard. And it's as advisors, it's hard to get people to sometimes do that. But yeah, clean sanitation is so important, and again, not just for foot rot. Now, they're not necessarily going to get foot rot from poor sanitation because again, that bacteria has to be introduced. But foot scald, definitely, or foot abscesses or things like that. Um, so again, it's got to be clean and dry. I know I used to travel to I think it was Jamaica, and all their goats would go out in the bush during the day and then come back at night because they have really bad predator larceny or theft, and they would just put up pallets so those goats they just find any ways to help those goats get up off the ground because they didn't use bedding, and so they needed to get those goats up off the ground, and the ones that didn't, it was a big issue. So yeah, sanitation is like goat raising 101. As far as who does hoof trimming, um, most producers learn how to do it themselves. It's definitely something that a vet wouldn't want to do it. There are some people that, like I said, there are people that will hoof trim for other people. I just saw somebody put a post on Facebook that they'll trim hooves for other people, and producers, they're some producers may be physically unable to trim hooves anymore, and they might want to take advantage of those kind of people. So there are people that'll do it, but most people learn how to do it. And if it physically gets harder, that's when it's not the trimming that's hard, it's the restraining. And then it becomes, man, maybe it's time to invest in a spin doctor or a sheep chair or something that's going to make it easier for me. But we can all learn to trim feet. It's not that hard. um, and and you can get lots of practice. Yeah, somebody learning from somebody who trimmed hooves. You know, I know that you probably have some field days in Missouri with you know, some on farm stuff, and you know, if that's important to people, you can have some, you know, get some practice doing it there.
So during the summer, yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah.
Somebody diseases caused by hoof trimming, can they be bad enough to lose the foot? I've never, knock on wood, I've never been exposed to where they've lost the hoof, just like I've never been exposed to a ewe losing its udder. So I'm sure, well, I take that back. I had a sheep once that had, it wasn't foot rot. It was called, I diagnosed it actually as septic pedal arthritis, and I ended up putting her, she had lambs, and once I got the lambs out of her, I ended up putting her down because there's just nothing I could do for it. So if you have one where the hoof gets so bad where it's not making progress and you know the animal's in pain, once it's clear of drugs, you could, you know, harvest it for meat, or if it, or put it down. I'm sure you can, you know, while I've not ever lost a hoof like that, like I said, other than that one, yeah, you can reach that point. And most of the time, um, I'm not going to say all the time, but a lot of the times, it's when animals get to the points they do, it's neglect, and we don't, and because it's hard work, again, you know, raising sheep and goats, and keeping on top of everything, and especially if you don't have a handling system and an easy way to look at them, it's a lot easier to see bottle jaw than it is a bad hoof. So a lot of times the only time we identify them as having a problem is if they're lame. And so you know, we need to catch these things before they get to those advanced stages, and then we don't have to worry about it. Is mycoplasma a cause of hoof rot? I don't know. Not what we would call, you know, foot rot's caused by that particular bacteria. Whether mycoplasm can have any effect on the hoof, I do not know, but it's not specifically cause foot rot. Rain scald, it could, that could be a colloquial name for foot rot, or foot scald in this case. When I was in West Virginia, my first job out of college, they call it foot rot, foot evil. So you never know what somebody might call it, but that would make sense. Rain, because wet, and scald between the toes, it would make sense, but I'd not heard of that. I do know that foot rot is a reportable disease in Australia, perhaps in New Zealand, I don't know. But things are different, you know, in Australia and New Zealand. The sheep industry means a lot more to them, unfortunately, than it does to us here. Can you imagine if it was reportable here? um, and you know, I'd have to read up on exactly what they do, but there's no reason to put any animal. It's not like scrapie. There's no reason to destroy animals. It can be eradicated. There's plenty of resources that show that foot rot can be eradicated. Plenty of them. But you can't, you know, different countries deal with things in different ways. I would, yeah. And so zinc sulfate is sometimes, again, it's what we use in the foot baths. Zinc sulfate is what we use in the sprays frequently, the hoof sprays after we trim hooves. And sometimes zinc sulfate is included in rations, so it's important. Most of the other treatments, like topical treatments, I can't think of all their names. I know Premier sells one that's like a paste, and I know there's zinc sulfate in it. Hoof and Heel probably has zinc sulfate in it. So zinc sulfate's kind of, it's a drying agent. It's kind of key to all of this stuff with the hooves.